You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 323, recorded on September 6th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Returning back on the line from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill. Glad to be back.
Well, Rachel, the summer is coming to a close, and WVUD had graciously allowed us to go back to an hour-long format for the summer to keep people occupied during the lockdown. But we've got folks coming back onto the radio station with more shows, more programming right after our time slot. So we are going to be returning to a half-hour time slot. Today we're going to be talking about the Pinkertons National Detective Agency and some of its sort of successor entities and its impact on both the past and the present. But as a result of us going back to the half-hour format, we have had to split some of the content. So we are basically going to be doing a two-part episode on the Pinkertons, focusing on two different areas. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between these areas, but we're going to be talking about sort of armed guard and strike-breaking functions, as well as their infiltration of labor unions and how that relates to, today's corporate efforts to try to prevent unionization, which is sort of one of the long ongoing legacies, even after the armed violent clashes eras has diminished for the most part. But as a result of that, because I did a lot of the historical stuff and Rachel did a lot of the present day stuff, Rachel's not going to be talking as much on this episode, but she'll have more to say on the second part, just so people understand why I'm talking as much. We weren't initially expecting that we were going to be doing it this way. So let's jump right into it, Rachel. I think you are going to be hearing a lot of topics that we have touched on previously. There's going to be a lot of tiebacks and themes, and I would love to get your thoughts on that as we go along. But let's get into it. The primary source that I used for my research on this was this fantastic book published in 2016 by S. Paul O'Hara, and it's a very long title because they're riffing on the dime store detective novel sort of theme. The title is Inventing the Pinkertons, or Spies, Sleuths, Mercenaries, and Thugs, being the story of the nation's most famous or infamous detective agency. Now, I didn't read all of the book, but it is quite short, and it's very much from a leftist perspective, not just a liberal perspective, in my opinion on the book anyway. And I found it very interesting, and he discusses a lot of different themes about the ways that the Pinkertons functioned and the tasks that they sort of performed. But let's talk about, from sort of the beginning of the book, some of his sort of thematic analysis. To challenge the Pinkertons was not only an act of defiance toward capitalism, progress, and industrial order, but also a criminal act. If corporate managers were the visible hand of the market, the Pinkertons were the market's visible fist. They were the shock troops of the industrial order. Between 1870 and 1937, they were the most visible element of capital's transformation and domination. They were the power and violence of capitalism at its most naked. If there were a single chattel principle to the 19th century industrialization, it would be this: industrialists had the power to kill their workers. Dangerous working conditions, starvation wages, the testimony of detectives, or the force of hired gunmen were all symbols of this power. Many countries around the world during the same period were creating national police forces, but the United States, on the other hand, simply outsourced this role to the Pinkertons. In addition to private contracts for the capitalists, the Pinkertons were repeatedly hired by the U.S. government or other lower levels of government, such as states or cities and towns, to perform state functions, including with the post office and the treasury departments, and to wield the government's delegated monopoly on violence before that delegation of power was withdrawn in the Progressive era following the Homestead Strike incident. This is why it's important to talk about the Pinkertons to understand American history and American capitalism specifically. So one reason that the federal government eventually rolled back the broad powers that it had been delegating or subcontracting to the Pinkertons was because progressive economic policy, according to the author of this book, S. Paul O'Hara, was essentially hostile to monopoly corporations, and monopoly corporations were the source of the Pinkerton contracts. They couldn't work for both the state and the capital once those two fell out of complete alignment. The Pinkertons, they were this detective agency, but they were also marketing themselves as a way to keep an eye on criminal conspiracies and organized labor and things like that. Quote, the American public understood conspiracies as threats because Pinkerton agents held the power to define threats to society. So let's get into sort of how they emerged to take on this role beyond just sort of being glorified bounty hunters and private eyes and Abraham Lincoln's personal security force. The shift comes in the 1870s, and you can see this very clearly within some of the rhetoric and advertising that the company had put out during this time period. So Alan Pinkerton, the founder, back in the early days, he had kind of a different perspective on labor, and he wasn't necessarily favorable toward labor unions, but it was more from this perspective of, well, every man should have the right to go sell his individual labor and negotiate the best deal, etc. And that was sort of the perspective. But as it became more of a financial imperative for the company to generate revenue, they started to turn toward these clients like the ones that subsequently would hire them to come up with the testimony to put the Haymarket bombers away. He pivoted during the 1877 railroad strike, which we discussed in episode 315, from a long-standing contention that criminal conspiracies basically did not exist, apart from the Molly Maguire's infiltration operation that he had begun in 1873 in Pennsylvania, which we also, I think, talked about on our Pennsylvania episode a little bit. And he had basically contended that all these criminal conspiracies that would become such an important part of the Pinkertons' business model, they didn't really exist. It was just public paranoia. And then suddenly, after the 1877 railroad strike, which we talked about previously, he's saying, no, the Pinkerton agency, not only are these real, but the Pinkertons can stop them. And this was a huge source of revenue after that point. In the early 1870s, he had kind of done this operation to disrupt the secret society of Irish miners and stuff in Pennsylvania, the so-called Molly Maguires. It's not even clear whether or not they really ever existed, but he had this whole infiltration scheme with this Irish guy to infiltrate their communities and so forth and betray them and all that. And this sort of opened the door to after 1877, and this railroad strike goes national and takes out all these rich tycoons by surprise. Suddenly he has this business model that he can say, oh, actually, these conspiracies definitely are real. They're not made up, and I alone can stop them. So in Chicago, the rich elites begin purchasing major caches of arms to donate to these newly emerging police forces and the state militias, but they also hire the Pinkertons to routinely infiltrate leftist labor organizations, such as anarchists and other trade union groups. We've actually discussed it on a whole bunch of different episodes, because we talked about it on the John P. Altgeld episode, Governor of Illinois, on episode 316. We obviously, in our two-part series from the Lend-Lease series on anarcho-syndicalists, we talked about the Haymarket bombings and the trials of the anarchists in 1886. They had previously to this been hired by this group of rich Chicago industrialists to infiltrate anarchists. As it became more of a financial imperative for the company to generate revenue, they started to turn toward these clients. Alan Pinkerton published an 1878 report on the 1877 railroad strike that insisted that the strikers, tramps, and communists were manipulating the working class into forming violent secret society labor unions with an ideology of European communism all across the nation's manufacturing communities in what he termed an infection, which he thought had to be stopped like any other disease. He did not acknowledge the material triggers of the strike, which we covered in our episode on the strike, such as wage cuts. People didn't like their wages getting cut. That made them mad. Didn't really have anything to do with tramps and communists. Pinkerton also contended or insisted that the Knights of Labor was a merger of the Molly Maguire's group in Pennsylvania that he had disrupted previously and exiled communards from Paris that had fled the 1871 Paris Commune collapse. But as he transitions the Pinkertons into this role as these sort of infiltration spies reporting on all these vast conspiracies of communists and anarchists and labor organizers and so forth. He actually then starts building up the what might essentially be termed the private army functions of the Pinkertons. And this becomes increasingly important up until the Homestead strike, at which point national public opinion starts to turn against the Pinkertons. Beginning in 1884, during a strike of coal miners in the Hocking Valley region of Ohio, Pinkerton detectives began to take on their new role as the armed protection details for scab workers brought in to break a strike, which led them into violent clashes with striking workers. By 1888, the Pinkertons had expanded their services to directly providing scab workers as well. Quote, between 1877 and 1892, the Pinkertons took an active part in at least 20 different strikes. In repeated incidents, however, as the book explains, verbal provocations by strikers toward armed Pinkertons resulted in the Pinkertons firing lethally into unarmed crowds. Newspapers and courts tended to hand-wave away eyewitness testimonies as being inherently biased against the Pinkertons specifically. Yeah, I wonder why. Even when other investigating authorities, such as coroners, would argue that no, the Pinkertons were definitely at fault for these massacres or these shootings or whatever happened. Now, in 1887, the Pinkertons shot a teenager in New Jersey who just happened to be there watching some sort of a strike at the docks, and the local police chief did persuade the contracting company to remove the Pinkertons from the situation given the public outcry. But this begins a shift where increasingly the Pinkertons specifically are coming under more and more scrutiny. And this is at this point after the Haymarket incident and the Haymarket trials. The United Labor Party denounced the shadowy quasi-governmental role of the Pinkertons and said, quote, Pinkerton men go from state to state committing murders for which none of them are ever brought to trial, end quote. The Federation of Organized Trades also denounced them by name, and a state trades assembly in New Jersey called them an quote, army of Hessian murderers, in reference to the Hessian mercenaries of the British Army during the Revolution that had been deployed to New Jersey. And this became a very popular metaphor to them. In fact, one of the chapters of the book just has quote after quote after quote comparing the Pinkerton's armed guard role, which Rachel's going to talk more about, and its parallels to present day or continuation to present day. That became a very popular thing to describe them as, was Hessian mercenaries. The same trade assembly said that the riches and power of the industrialists, quote, had made them so arrogant that it is only a question of a short time when each one of them will become a feudal lord with his own private department of murder, end quote. Now that I thought was particularly fascinating as well, because it turns out, as there's a lot of quotes in this book from firsthand sources, this idea during the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution that these rich guys were becoming neo-feudal lords was a popular talking point at the time, and is something that we hear today as well. The Knights of Labor argued that armed Pinkertons tended to inflame situations, quote, just as a red flag acts on a bull. A common thread throughout the book is how favorable toward the Pinkertons major newspapers were, especially the New York Times, and how absurdly dismissive they were of any worker objections or even politician and law enforcement objections made toward the Pinkertons. The 1890 New York Central strike started with a very conscientious effort by the Knights of Labor to keep things peaceful, to shake off their growing public reputation of being associated with worker violence. So they sort of had this respectability campaign they were going to do. And this reputation was unfortunately already linked to agitation and attacks by Pinkertons in earlier strikes. But within weeks, in 1890, this New York Central strike had devolved into gunfire on both sides. However, newspapers this time, apart from the still very pro-Pinkerton New York Times, tended to use the phrase Pinkerton roughs and ascribe blame to their violent intervention. Local police attempted to remove or even arrest Pinkerton shooters, and Pinkertons refused to allow this and beat an officer. Workers also alleged that the Pinkertons were engaging in sabotage of railroad property to make the Knights of Labor look bad, while the Knights continued to urge calm and non-violence, as well as not engaging with the Pinkertons to try to bolster their reputation. The Knights even urged workers not to joke about taking violent action because Pinkerton spies might overhear and have them convicted on false charges. And we're going to talk in part 2 a lot more about Pinkerton's spies. The Knights of Labor also began a fierce public relations campaign to win over newspapers to the workers and against the Pinkertons, even going as far as to suggest that Pinkertons had a clear financial incentive to create violent chaos because then it would justify giving them more and longer contracts. The Pinkertons contended to industrialists that, quote, all capital so invested is practically at the mercy of secret labor organization whose tyranny and despotism exceed anything ever known in the history of the world, end quote. The Knights argued by The Knights responded by arguing that, quote, their existence as a detective agency depends upon their detecting something. In order to prevent the occupations from vanishing, they conjure up the imaginary where the real world would not answer their purpose, end quote. Another quote, there exists no necessity whatever for the existence of a wandering army of vagabonds raked together from the four quarters of the earth to engage in labor disputes. Capital makes a mistake in engaging these vagrants. And that's something that Rachel's also going to talk about when we get more to this issue of private security, is this notion of like, who are these guys that are being brought in to do this private security? They seem pretty violent. Now, the New York Central strike ended in deep failure for the Knights, particularly when other rail workers in different unions refused to join the strike in solidarity. But state officials in New York were at the very least persuaded that the Pinkertons had probably made the situation worse and that it might be appropriate for the state to step in once in a while to mediate strikes instead of letting them be resolved by uncontrolled private force. So the Homestead strike gets its own chapter in the book because of how profound a shift it brought into the reputation of the Pinkertons. Brutal anti-worker actions at the Homestead strike of 1892 in Pennsylvania, which we discussed in episode 225, sharply turned much of public and media opinion against the agency. The American Journal of Politics expressed bewilderment that the workers had been charged with, quote, treason for their shootout with the Pinkertons, who were hired by the manager of the steel mill and not working on behalf of the government. As a side note, nobody on either side of the shootout ended up being convicted of anything, including murder. Another writer expressed consternation that, quote, millionaires are permitted to hire and drill the scum of society to shoot down workers. An increasing number of national-level politicians began to worry after Homestead that if Pinkerton thugs regularly inspired armed worker self-defense, as at Homestead, it would inevitably lead to civil war. Congress convened an investigation not just into Homestead, but into the broader questions about whether or not an armed private security force should be allowed to operate unregulated, and whether or not local law enforcement was right to deputize them to act for the government too. Law enforcement testimony was split between those who openly believed that the Pinkertons exacerbated situations and those who believed that the working classes could only be contained by the explicit fear of the Pinkertons' willingness to use deadly force with little provocation. The House report in this investigation included a majority and minority report. The majority report called the Pinkertons, quote, a mercenary private police force that may properly be characterized as a sort of private military or police force and produce irritation among the strikers, frequently resulting in hostile demonstrations and bloodshed. The minority report stated that, quote, Pinkertons have grown to undue and in some degree menacing proportions with its officers, corps of drilled men, and supply of arms. It is the nature of a military force under the control of private individuals to be hired out to whomever may be willing to engage it. The Senate findings suggested that the mere fact of the now constant reliance on armed Pinkertons demonstrated that the state was unable to maintain order when necessary, and that if that was true, then the country was basically already in a state of anarchy. Senator John Palmer of Illinois denounced the Pinkertons as enemies to mankind that ought to be hunted down. Governor Altgeld, as we talked about in episode 316, pardons people for allegedly instigating the Haymarket bombing. Some of them were executed before he was governor, on the basis that the Pinkertons had actually caused the violent clashes at Haymarket. Congress was uncertain as to whether or not it could act federally to ban the use of armed Pinkertons nationwide under constitutional powers interpretations present at the time, but it did pass the first anti-Pinkerton law banning federal agencies from outsourcing to the Pinkertons, as well as banning them in the District of Columbia. However, this was taken as enough of a green light for 23 states to pass their own state-level laws shortly after. And even the pro-Pinkerton New York Times began to raise questions after the disastrous battle at the Homestead strike, alleging that the Pinkertons' reserve force of armed guards were generally forcibly recruited for specific incidents among known criminals that the Pinkertons monitored and tracked. The Times also observed that generally after each labor clash, some state legislators in every state had attempted to ban the use of these mercenaries, but the Pinkertons had always managed to stop the bills from passing. The Times also was willing to print a quote from Samuel Gompers of the AFL Union, attributing the violence at Homestead to the Pinkertons and denouncing the private mercenary force as, quote, contrary to all American principles and ideas, end quote. Harper's Weekly said, quote, when such an agency also furnishes armed bodies of men for the defense of factories or railroad shops in case of troubles between employers and working men, it assumes a different character. It becomes in a large sense a private military organization, keeping itself in a state of readiness to call into active service at short notice. It has a standing corps of experienced officers, captains and lieutenants, and a body of trained privates large enough to form the nucleus of a little army. Some members of organized labor, however, immediately recognized that the real legacy of the Homestead strike was not the fall from grace and power of the Pinkertons, but instead the rise of state militias, as well as federal troops, as an explicitly anti-labor force of capital in their place. This had happened at Homestead, but the wave of anti-Pinkerton laws that followed essentially cemented this new function. Now, in our part 2, we're going to be talking about the Pinkertons' role in the Mountain West and some of their labor infiltration and spying activities. But Rachel is going to talk about how, despite the efforts to reduce the role of the private security functions and security force characteristics of the Pinkertons agency, that has actually continued to present day.
Yeah, so the modern day Pinkertons were acquired by Securitas, which is a Swedish security agency, in 1999. And in August 2000, they acquired Burn Security, which is one of their biggest rivals in the U.S., and also several regional security companies in the U.S. So these acquisitions made Securitas one of the largest security companies in the world. In 2001, a new organization took effect with 5 business areas according to types of services offered, and Loomis Fargo and Company, which you may have seen their armored money trucks, was also acquired. In 2013, Securitas acquired Pinkerton Government Services, which provides cleared security services to governmental agencies and programs that require a Department of Defense or Department of Energy security clearance. This government services division of Securitas became known as Securitas Critical Infrastructure Services. This division operates both in the U.S. and worldwide when cleared services are needed overseas. So operations are still under the brand name Pinkerton. These services include due diligence, background checks, security assessments, brand protection, intellectual property protection, executive protection, investigations, cyber surveillance, computer forensics, social compliance, and IT security. So a lot of these are the modern day investigation services that Pinkerton has provided over the past couple centuries. So in 2018, there was a communication workers strike against Frontier Communications in West Virginia and Virginia, and Frontier alleged that some of its cables were cut with an axe or shot with a shotgun, and that striking workers were driving recklessly, quote unquote, around work sites. This is from a New Republic article in 2018. So Frontier offered a reward of $10,000 for information about the identity of the vandals, and the company took out a temporary injunction that it said it needed to keep the strike peaceful. In this legal complaint was the news that the company was employing Pinkerton Consulting and Investigations for quote-unquote security services, and the Pinkertons claimed that striking workers had quote-unquote abused them. This was according to the West Virginia Gazette Mail. The workers disputed these accusations, and in fact, Scab committed the strike's only threat of violence when he pulled out a gun to intimidate strikers. So this article kind of goes into a little bit of the history, but also how they're operating in the modern day. They are intact largely on the strength of their ability to intimidate, surveil, and gather intelligence about workers. On its website, the company advertises, quote, global protective intelligence, produced in part by agents who are embedded or on call. Corporate agents can access the Pinkerton Vigilance Network, which consists of the firm's agents, government agencies, and over 1,000 private sources. The goal is to help corporations manage risk on all fronts, from natural disasters to political events. It's really easy to see the parallel between the historical actions of the Pinkertons and right through to today. They're still kind of sowing discord. They're painting workers as violent and troublesome and prone to acts of sabotage. So that's kind of, it's kind of scary to see how they're using the old plays from their playbook, and it still kind of seems to work. The New Republic article describes an ad from Securitas and Pinkerton. They list, quote, labor demonstrations among the risks that can monitor. Trouble can happen anywhere, anytime, a narrator intones. I guess it's not quite as out in the open as it used to be, and Pinkerton is now kind of operating kind of in the shadows, but they're still around. They're still trying to, quote, investigate labor organizing and kind of escalating the violence and escalating tensions between workers and management.
Well, next week, as I said, we're going to talk more about some of their other activities in disrupting labor, both past and present. But as you note, there's just so many clear parallels here between the original Gilded Age and our current time. And Pinkerton happens to be one of the literally continuous threads connecting both of those time periods. They have not gone away. And we've got a lot more for you on the Pinkertons. And Rachel's got a lot more research as well to present. But Rachel, thank you for being on for part 1 this week.
Thanks, Bill.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest, Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 324, recorded on September 13th, 2020. This week, we're going to be doing part 2 of our Pinkertons episode that we started last week. Welcome back to the show, Rachel.
Good to be here.
So last week we talked about the Pinkertons as an armed guard force and some of their private security roles that are ongoing to present day. Today, however, we're going to be talking about the Pinkertons detective agency role in infiltrating labor movements and trying to disrupt union formation and strikes through infiltration rather than armed confrontation in the Second Industrial Revolution period and all the way to the Great Depression. And then Rachel is going to talk about their current activities as well as some of the peer companies that still engage in some of these similar type of labor infiltration practices. So again, the book that we were mainly relying on for the historical sections last week is the one we're relying on again this week. This is the book Inventing the Pinkertons, or Spies, Sleuths, Mercenaries, and Thugs, being the story of the nation's most famous or infamous detective agency by S. Paul O'Hara, Johns Hopkins University Press, 2016. So, as I said, last week we talked about their activities in terms of strike breaking, but we also, with armed force, but we also talked about how they had infiltrated the anarchist groups to provide false testimony regarding the Haymarket bombings and things like that. So in addition to infiltrating labor societies like the Molly Maguires or labor radicals like the Chicago anarchists, infiltrating nascent union activities and exaggerating threats to the capitalist owners who paid the Pinkertons became the bread and butter of the Pinkertons financially, particularly as their armed guard role either became less socially acceptable or was outright outlawed by various governments in the United States. So in the chapter on Private Army of Capital, the Pinkertons' role as that, S. Paul O'Hara notes that a secret advertisement to businesses from the Pinkertons was leaked at one point in the 1890s, which outlined their services against labor organization. Quote, corporations are individuals desirous of ascertaining the feeling of their employees and whether they are likely to engage in strikes or are joining in any secret labor organizations with a view of compelling terms from corporations or employers can obtain on application to the superintendent of either of the Pinkerton offices a detective suitable to associate with their employees and obtain this information. It is frequently the case that by taking a matter of this kind in hand in time and discovering the ringleaders and dealing promptly with them, serious trouble may be avoided in the future. Now, a lot of what we talked about last week was the Pinkertons' armed guard role in the East Coast or Midwestern industrial cities, and in a lot of cases they could go and hire people pretty quickly who didn't have any particular connection to the people that were on strike, and so they could be brought in to beat them up or shoot them or whatever, and it wasn't that big of a deal for the Pinkertons to do that. However, in more sparsely populated areas such as the Mountain West, this was not really a viable strategy. It would have been probably cost prohibitive to be shipping in armed strike breakers, I think, is my sense from reading the book, from places like Chicago or thereabouts to, say, Denver or Boise or someplace like that. So there's a whole chapter in the book on the closed frontier of the Mountain West, and that was sort of where their infiltration function was much more predominant than their guard functions in the East. So in the 1890 census, the frontier was considered to be closed, and the western role of the Pinkertons was already shifting away from its functions of glorified bounty hunting and bank or train robbery investigations from the so-called Wild West days, and more toward its conventional role within consolidated capitalism, although they still sometimes spied on various rough characters and troublemakers on behalf of territorial or state governments in the West. And, of course, famously, they were certainly pursuing Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and their Wild Bunch gang as late as 1899 and several years after that. So it wasn't a completely seamless transition to this new role, but it is important to understand that with the closing of the frontier, and you're moving away from, as we've talked about on previous episodes, the individual guys going out to a gold rush site or something like that and trying to, pan for gold or stake a claim, that kind of thing. All these different things, as we talked about in agriculture as well in the West, you start getting major capital forces from the major cities coming in and saying, all right, we're going to industrialize the processes of mining and farming and ranching and all these other things. We're going to have these huge landowners and that kind of thing come in and replace some of these smallholders. And the Pinkertons were there to provide services to these major capital formations. So in the East, they had been working for factory owners, but in the West, they were working on labor infiltration and some armed guard functions on behalf of mine owners and ranching tycoons. Now, on an episode a while back on the show, we talked about some of the mining-related labor militancy and strikes in Idaho, but one that we didn't talk about as much was the first conflict at Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1892. The more famous one is the one that happened at the end of the very end of the 19th century. This was several years before that. This was a literally explosive conflict that was happening simultaneously with the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania that we talked about a lot last week. The conflict in Coeur d'Alene resulted in the U.S. Army intervening, creating detention camps for strikers and imposing military rule for 4 months. And this was the direct result of Union anger over being infiltrated by high-level Pinkerton operatives. This also served to provide a model for the company as the Homestead. This also served to provide capitalists with a model as the Homestead strike had. Pinkertons would serve as infiltration of the unions, but state militias and federal troops would come in for the actual armed suppression instead of Pinkerton armed guards doing it. This model was repeated in the 1899 strike at Coeur d'Alene, which we discussed in episode 220. Often, the governors would act quickly to move in troops at the first signs of strikes provoked by Pinkerton agents, given that striking miners could detonate large quantities of explosives to disrupt the mine, or if scab workers incompetently detonated the mines by accident, even if there was no other violence. So there was an incentive for a government intervention very quickly with the mines in a way that was not necessarily true for eastern factories. The Denver office operations in the entire Mountain West region were generally overseen by James McParland, who had been the very first infiltration agent of the Pinkertons ever back in the early 1870s with the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. Controversially, as we talked about on that previous episode, the Pinkertons also illegally kidnapped Bill Haywood, a future IWW co-founder from Wyoming, and delivered him across state lines to stand trial in Idaho on false charges, which proved to be another blow for the Pinkertons. Another blow against the Pinkertons in public opinion, as we discussed in those previous episodes, particularly given Clarence Darrow's vicious skewering of them during the trial while serving as defense counsel. One of Darrow's star witnesses was a Pinkerton stenographer at the Denver office named Morris Friedman, who had access to lots of files and went on to publish a book called The Pinkerton Labor Spy that stripped away whatever remaining mystique the agency had. He compared the agency's anti-labor persecution to that of the Imperial Russian Secret Police, and apparently it came to light later that the Russian Secret Police literally once paid the Pinkertons to follow a Russian liberal on a U.S. trip. They were working for the Tsar. This was before the Soviet Union. He also alleged that he had been routinely ordered to doctor reports from regional agents and spies to greatly inflate the threat posed by organized labor so that the Denver office could sell more contracts to spooked tycoons. The book was followed. This book by Morris Friedman was then followed by a tell-all book by one of the top Pinkerton agents in the Mountain West, Charles Siringo, whose falling out with the agency led him to spill a lot of their secret activities and provocations, many of which he had himself led. He even acknowledged Pinkerton fabrications of evidence against Chicago anarchists in relation to the Haymarket trial, although he personally railed against labor unions in the book himself as well. And then, final point from the book on this topic, in the chapter on the rise of the state, despite all of their efforts to stop unions from forming in the first place, many unions did form. So then the next stage was for the Pinkertons to keep infiltrating those unions once they had been established. Labor infiltration by the Pinkertons continued, but guard functions and increasingly detective functions were taken over by new state forces and agencies, as well as competing private detective services. Other companies also specialized in scab labor provision and took that function away from the Pinkertons because the reputation of the Pinkertons was so damaged that it was dangerous for new companies that were trying to brand themselves as families as a way of trying to stop labor organization, right? These are the companies that say, oh, you don't need a union, we're like a family. And you can't really hire the guys who are known to hire scab labor and shoot crowds of strikers. So they started looking for other companies. But the Pinkertons remained this very important force in terms of labor infiltration all the way into the Great Depression. So in 1936, Senator Robert La Follette, the progressive from the upper Midwest, took advantage of growing fears of fascism and the sense that private bands of armed thugs working for industrialists was closer to Mussolini's black shirts or Hitler's brown shirts than anything else. And so he used that as a pretext, kind of conflating the two issues of their armed guard functions from before, as well as their labor infiltrations, as a pretext to convene hearings specifically targeting all of the Pinkertons' remaining activities and crimes that were being overlooked up until that point. La Follette especially focused on the notion that spying and infiltration of labor by the Pinkertons and their competition was an unfair restraint against the rights of workers of free speech and free assembly. The La Follette investigation found that American labor unions were filled to the gills with undercover private spies working on behalf of not only the corporations, but also middle and lower managers, sometimes just going off and hiring them on their own without official sign-off from the company, because, of course, if you were the lower manager who busted up some particular union activity or nascent union, then that would probably help you get promoted. In some cases, the spies had actually risen to positions of power within the unions, various leadership roles, without being detected or exposed as Pinkerton spies. In 1937, as a result of these investigations by La Follette, Pinkerton and competitor companies were compelled to dissolve their anti-union spying divisions, although, of course, as Rachel is about to talk about, these legacies live on in other forms to the present day, including the Pinkerton division of Securitas AB themselves, which we talked about last week. So Rachel, could you talk to me now about what the Pinkertons specifically are doing in terms of labor infiltration, and also what some of their sort of competitor companies are doing for the major technology firms and other sort of giant corporations now?
Right. So first I'll start with a 2018 Guardian article talking about how Silicon Valley tech firms often surveil their workers outside of work hours. So Pinkerton, as we talked about before, is kind of this intelligence agency that offers kind of investigations on workers' activities and what they're doing. In Silicon Valley, Pinkerton offers to send investigators to coffee shops or restaurants near a company's campus to eavesdrop on employees' conversations. So this is to kind of clamp down on like IP leaks, product information, business venture information, stock information. So one of these managing director at Pinkerton is quoted as saying, "If we hear anything about a new product coming or new business ventures or something to do with stocks, we'll feed that information back to corporate security." So their focus is kind of insider trading or IP theft, ostensibly. Facebook and Google deny using these services. However, through LinkedIn searches, The Guardian found that former Pinkerton investigators have been hired subsequently by Facebook, Google, and Apple. So it's kind of a open secret that these companies are keeping tabs on their employees and tracking their activities outside of work. More recently, in April of 2020, The Verge came out with an article talking about how Amazon and Whole Foods specifically, which is owned by Amazon, has created a unionization heat map that uses several different metrics to kind of rank which Whole Food stores are at higher risk of unionization and are higher labor activities. So there's a few categories of risk: external risks, store risks, and team member sentiment. So external risks are local union membership size, distance in miles between the store and the closest union, number of charges filed with the National Labor Relations Board alleging labor law violations, and also what is called a, quote, labor incident tracker, which logs incidents related to organizing and union activity, and also the percentage of families within the store's zip code that fall below the poverty line, and also the local unemployment rate. So zeroing in on the store risks are average store compensation, average total store sales, a diversity index that represents the racial and ethnic diversity of every store. So a lower diversity index equals a higher risk of unionization because it's kind of well known that it's hard to get different races together for labor efforts, and labor has kind of always had this history of being more segregated. So a lower diversity, higher risk of unionization. And also the rates of workers' comp claims. Team member sentiment is pretty self-explanatory. Just employees' feedback on quality and safety of their work environment and whether they feel supported and respected. And the article also kind of goes into the anti-union propaganda that Whole Foods is giving the workers. There's oftentimes at orientation, there's anti-union videos that you have to watch before you start working there. And also they kind of gave the line that's pretty common among anti-union efforts, that they value the individual members' agency in coming to managers with grievances on their own. Like, you don't need a union. You can talk to your manager and with your concerns, and nothing bad will happen to you. I think they've been hitting that pretty heavily over the past couple years, this individual contribution line. Also, Amazon is in the news recently. They had a job application open that was asking for people who were for analysts that were preferably fluent in a second language and had prior experience in analytics from, quote, the intelligence community, the military, law enforcement, or related global security role in the private sector. Also from the listing, the analyst's key responsibilities would be to compile white papers and reports for senior company leadership with assessments of certain risk factors. The, quote, dynamic situations upon which the holder of the position would be expected to report include, quote, protests, geopolitical crises, conflicts impacting operations, and other, quote, sensitive topics. The analyst would also report on highly confidential matters, including labor organizing threats against the company, and they would also establish and track funding and activities connected to corporate campaigns, both internal and external, against Amazon. Last but not least, the analyst would help Amazon's in-house lawyers put together documents for use in court filings, quote, including restraining orders against activist groups, since legal uses intelligence assessments to demonstrate to courts of law that activist groups harbor intent for continued illegal activity vis-a-vis Amazon. After these job postings surfaced on the internet and were reported about widely, I found an article from arstechnica.com. Then these postings disappeared, and it was kind of said that it was a mistake that this job description was posted, and that they didn't mean to describe the activities of these postings in this way, which was pretty transparently false. One of the directors of Athena, which is an employee activist group that Amazon wants to gather intelligence against, is quoted in the article saying, "Workers, especially Black workers, have been telling us all for months that Amazon is targeting them for speaking out. This job description is proof that Amazon intends to continue on this course. Every single person in the United States has the right to speak up and to join with others to improve the conditions under which we live and work. and we have every right to demand better for our communities from a corporation worth $1 trillion. This article came out September 2nd, and the quote continues, and since Monday is Labor Day, let's remember that Pinkertons and, quote, goon squads didn't stop communities around coal mines or auto plants or sugar plantations from organizing for real democracy in past centuries, and these intelligence analysts won't stop us now. So I think labor leaders are pretty well in tune with Pinkertons and other groups seeking to infiltrate and surveil these labor groups. So I think even though the toolkit that Pinkertons and other groups are using now are way more sophisticated, I think the fact that we have knowledge that these activities are happening can help arm us against being surveilled and being infiltrated. So I think knowing the history of the Pinkertons is pretty important, just so that we have this knowledge of the tools that they use. It would be really interesting to read that tell-all book that was published way back in the day to see if those are the same techniques that are being used today. Also from The Verge, the news just came out that General Keith Alexander joined the board of directors for Amazon. So General Keith Alexander, if you don't know who he is, was the director of the NSA during the Edward Snowden leaks, and he was critical of the reporting that was going on the documents that Snowden released. So I think this just kind of signals that Amazon doesn't really have a problem with intelligence gathering and kind of shady activities of surveillance of their workers and other people. If you've read anything about the NSA during that time, during the PRISM data gathering efforts, they were just ruled unconstitutional. So I think this is kind of a clear signal from Amazon that they're kind of doubling down on this intelligence gathering and this anti-union efforts and anti-worker efforts. One other thing from the Ars Technica article is that it was recently uncovered that Amazon is monitoring social media discussions of workers who use the Amazon Flex delivery app. So workers have been kind of complaining about this Flex app because it offers plum gigs to people that can reach an Amazon distribution center or a Whole Foods restaurant or Whole Foods store the fastest. And so people have been hanging phones and trees outside of these distribution centers to kind of get the leg up on their fellow gig workers. So there's been a lot of complaints happening to Amazon and also on social media. So this tool that Amazon uses was exposed on a website called Shark and Ink. The site had no obvious ties to Amazon, and the tool does not use traditional Amazon infrastructure, suggesting that Amazon wanted to keep the tool and its surveillance secret. After the story was published, however, Amazon did confirm that the information the reporters found was indeed genuine. Amazon was monitoring more than 60 groups. Employees were not supposed to make public the existence of the social media monitoring program, according to a page that was included among the files. This is quoted from the instructions. The information related to different posts reported out from various social forums are classified. Do not share without proper authentication. Most of the post/comment screenshots within the site are from closed Facebook groups. It will have a detrimental effect if it falls within the reach of any of our delivery partners. Do not share without proper authentication. So they were obviously aware that if people knew that they were being watched on these closed Facebook groups, they would stop sharing this information. So this is basically a mirror of what happened in the past. They're infiltrating these closed groups to keep tabs on them and to report back to the companies what workers are saying about them.
As always, all of the links that we've talked about today, all of our notes will be in a PDF up at arsenalfordemocracy.com. We almost always release one with each episode so that you can follow along or do more research. There's also stuff that we didn't really have a chance to get into, such as the Pinkertons' continued obsession, which they were obsessed all the way back in the 19th century with this, but protecting their own image legally in terms of how it's represented even in fictional media, which came up most recently with the Red Dead Redemption 2 video game, which is set during the late 19th century. And Rachel, thank you so much for doing all the research about what the Pinkertons have been up to lately, as well as some of their peer groups following their sort of infiltration and spying model.
Thanks, Bill. It's always a pleasure.